Hello and welcome back to That Aged Well. This week I'm joined by Robin Douglas, who has written Paganism Persisting. And we're going to talk about the revival of paganism today, but before we do that, I want to begin by announcing I'm starting a second podcast that is going to be twice a month podcast, and it's going to be about Star Trek of all things. So it will be quite different from this. But what is, I find it's going to be called To Boldly Talk Where No Man Has Talked Before, and I really like that title. And it's going, my co-host, which I have a co-host this time, he has been on this podcast. His name is Thomas Mackey. He held the record of being on the podcast most times. He has been on it 4 times. Our first episode is scheduled for 21st May, so stay tuned for a brand new Star Trek podcast. The goal is to discuss anything Star Trek. So if you are a Trekkie like me, try and stay tuned, and it's going to be much fun. And with that out of the way, we discussed this a bit before the recording, so it is kind of an unusual topic to discuss that we're going to discuss today. As I mentioned, your book Paganism Persisting, which is coming out October 2024. So how did this topic come about? How did you come about studying this topic?
Well, I started out studying classics. That was many years ago, and I specialised in ancient history, studying the history of ancient Greece and Rome, and particularly focusing on religious history and religious ideas in ancient Greece. That's my initial academic background, and that then evolved into studying what's known as classical reception, which is what people in later times have made of the legacy of Greek and Roman culture. And the revival of classical religion is part of that. And it is a very niche topic. There's still a lot of work to be done on it. It's a relatively small field, but it's a field that's grown a lot over the last few decades, particularly since the 1990s. And it's an absolutely fascinating area. And it's one that can teach us a lot the about wider themes in modernity, about how people in modern European and American culture have got to grips with the religious options that are available to them, and how revived paganism can shed light on broader cultural trends and currents. Um, and it also intersects with other areas such as the history of esotericism, beliefs in magic, clairvoyance, and the paranormal, all that kind of thing. And yeah, it's for me, it's a really rich area of research that there's plenty more work to be done on it. There's been some excellent work that's been done to date, particularly by a guy called Ronald Hutton, who's the kind of patron saint, if you like, of this area of study. But there's a lot more work to be done. It's a relatively young field, and it's great to be able to be one of the people who's taking the field forward.
It would be fun if we inspired someone today to go study this field further on and continue the search for this. And I want to begin because, of course,
Absolutely.
we mentioned this in an episode on Christianity. Of course, we don't have to repeat too much because we talked a lot about this before. But Constantine, he kind of made the Roman Empire Christian, and he legalized the Christian culture. And most people probably think, oh, paganism disappeared and then they were all Christian. But that's, as you may guess from this episode, was not the case. So I want to begin with after the death of Constantine and talk about his nephew Julian because he actually uh, tried to revive. He's one of the first, perhaps, to try to revive paganism again into the Roman Empire. So let's begin to talk about Julian and why did it fail to was he close to be successful in reviving paganism, or was he doomed to fail from the start?
Yeah, Julian is a fascinating character. As you say, he was the nephew of Constantine, who was the first Christian emperor, and he was raised in a very Christian environment. He was raised in a very austere environment, very Christian, also very military. and very political. But he rebelled against that environment. Um, he was interested in philosophy. As a young man, he studied philosophy, and secretly, already as a young adult, he was inwardly rebelling against his Christian upbringing and embracing pagan ideas. And he found himself in the year 355 as one of the deputy emperors of the Roman Empire. This is a period where there isn't necessarily one emperor, that there are several. Um, and yes, in 355, I believe it was, he became deputy emperor. And then in 361, he became the sole emperor of the Roman Empire. His only other rival conveniently died at just the right time. And from 361 to 363, he ruled over the Roman Empire unchallenged, and then died in battle in 363. He was only about 30 at the time. So his life and his career were both brief. He was a strange guy. When he was a student, he was seen as being a bit of an eccentric, um, a bit of a sort of Sheldon Cooper character. It would be a bit like Sheldon Cooper becoming president. And when he suddenly became deputy emperor, um, there's this um, episode where he has his philosopher's beard kind of symbolically shaved off by the barbers. And that points to the contrast between this slightly odd, eccentric academic life he'd had up until then, and the public life that he would have as an emperor and a political figure after that. But he proved to be surprisingly good at being an emperor. He had a talent for administration. He even had a talent for being a soldier. And in 361, after he became the sole unchallenged emperor, he unveiled his pagan religious convictions. He'd kept quiet about his beliefs even when he was deputy emperor. But from 361, there was no reason to conceal his beliefs anymore. So he came out of the closet and he started trying to rebuild the temples, reopen the old temples, start up the sacrifices again. Um, he discriminated against Christians. He didn't persecute Christians, um, which led some Christians to say that he'd been devilishly clever because he denied them the status of martyrdom. But he did legally favour paganism and discriminated against the Christian religion. And he made a certain amount of progress, but this was cut short when he died in 363 after less than 2 years as sole emperor. And it's tempting to look at 363 as being one of these great turning points. You can see it as being like 1492 or like 1789, one of these great world historical years, because from that point onwards, it was unbroken Christian dominance. So it's tempting to see 363 as being the point at which Christianity finally took over. But really, Julian was already swimming against the tide. Even if he'd lived longer, and even if he'd had the chance to make greater efforts to revive the pagan past, you can question whether he would have been successful, because Christianity was already pretty dominant by the 360s. Um, and it's I mean, we'll never know now what would have happened if he'd had more time and been able to invest more energy and more resources in the pagan project. But we can doubt perhaps that he would have been able to turn the clock back. And indeed, his form of paganism wasn't necessarily an exercise in turning the clock back, because you can never really turn the clock back in history. Traditionalism is always at two removes from tradition. You can
Was
never
it a form
simply.
of neo-paganism in a sense that they tried to do?
Yeah, you could call it that, because it was influenced by aspects of Christianity. Julian saw himself as a kind of pope. He sent out these letters like papal encyclicals. He saw himself as the leader of this pagan clerical hierarchy. He explicitly borrowed Christian teachings on charity to the poor. He felt that Christianity had really showed up paganism there, and that pagans would have to raise their game to compete with Christianity. So he explicitly added this ethic of charity to paganism. So he was a traditionalist, he was a restorationist, he was trying to turn the clock back, but there were also elements of novelty in what he was doing. He was influenced by Christianity, just as all revivalists have been, because you can never escape your surroundings. Revival is always about responding to the present as well as restoring the past.
Mm. I want to turn a little bit from Constantinople, and I don't know if you haven't spoken about this before, but I want to. So I try to on the spot a little bit, but I want to talk a little bit about Alexandria, and there's a woman there. I'm sure you know who I'm talking about, and Hypatia. So that's
Hypatia.
she as well, of course, were a pagan, known pagan, and so let's talk a little bit of her view and how that her pagan beliefs ended up in her, for lack of a better word, martyrdom in a sense.
Yes, the story of Hypatia. Yes, this is interesting because she's seen as being something of a martyr figure. She was killed by a Christian mob. Um, but as is often the case with these things, my understanding of that episode is that there was a large element of politics in that. There is religion, there is religious bigotry, religious sectarianism, but I believe there was a lot of politics mixed into that episode as well. Um, and it's often the case that the mundane political aspect of episodes like that gets left aside because it's tempting to create this story of martyrdom and to see Hypatia as being this victim of religious repression and religious fanaticism. Um, it's often not quite that simple. In the same way that Constantine's conversion to Christianity in the first place took place in a particular political context. It's not just about ideas and individuals who believe in those ideas. There's a material, political, military context to these things too.
Mm. So I wanted to, so how would this persist? How was she viewed as a pagan and as a woman as well in Christian Alexandria? And that's because she's, like you said, she ended up being murdered, but she did teach. I think she's taught medicine, right? So was she looked at kind of as a what is that witch in a sense?
Well, I believe that she was a philosopher in the Neoplatonist tradition, um, which was a kind of, how would we describe it today? Not merely a form of philosophy, but a form of spirituality as well. And for some people, it could be a form of magic. Um, and it's the same tradition that the Emperor Julian was trained in as well. Um, so it wasn't just something that's academic and intellectual. It intersected with spirituality, with, as I say, with magic and with esotericism and that sort of thing. And so a figure like Hypatia is, I suppose, an example of this lost culture in which academia and philosophy and the intellectual realm intersected with the religious spiritual realm. Um, it's that's something that's unfamiliar to us today, but by studying figures like Hypatia and Julian for that matter, and the Alexandrians in general, we can rediscover this quite interesting and unfamiliar world in which philosophy and spirituality intersected and were inseparable.
How when Christianity grew in the Roman world, how did were paganism? Was it kind of like a, to compare with Islam and Christianity, or did it kind of get along, those who persisted to the pagan religion, or did they kind of like you're I don't know if this was a term still, but did the Christians view them as infidels, And how did they throw it? Because I imagine the paganism couldn't have just disappeared overnight, right? It took a few decades or centuries, maybe. But how did they approach it if they approached it at all?
Well, that's an interesting question. Traditionally, the narrative has been a very simple one, very black and white, where Christianity comes along and conquers and defeats the pagan past. And it's been told in a triumphalist way that the light of the gospel overcomes the darkness of paganism. Uh, but in reality, things are never quite so simple. And there is a period of interaction and coexistence between paganism and Christianity in the 300s and even the 400s. Among Christians, you did have radicals. You had people who genuinely hated paganism, thought it was devilish, and wanted to stamp it out. You also had moderates, and people who sought for an accommodation between the two cultures, people who were proud of their pagan past while also being Christians. And you also get Christianity borrowing quite a lot of things from paganism. And that can be things like forms of worship, buildings and architecture, feast days, elements of theology, even. And it's in a sense it suits both sides, looking back on this, to deny this, and to say that actually you have one culture which was replaced by another different and antagonistic culture, but it was more of a merger. There was more mutual influence than people might wish to admit. Christians today would find it convenient to say it's just black and white, it's light overcoming darkness. Some modern pagans would say it's the same, but it's the, the polarities are reversed, and that it was a pagan society that was tragically overcome and destroyed by Christianity. The reality is a bit more messy. You have influence, you have mutual interaction between the two sides. It's not simply a matter of black overcoming white or white overcoming black.
Was it like when, later where oh, you're a Christian, you can't marry a Jew, or you can't marry a Muslim, you have to convert, etc. Was it kind of like just more relaxed in the sense that oh, she's marrying a pagan, and it's fine, whatever, or was it like you're dead to us kind of, or how was it kind of when with marriage alliances and etc. when with paganism and Christianity. How did this work?
Well, it's gradual. It happens over a long period of time, and it involves many different people of different levels of radicalism. And I mean, Constantine becomes a Christian in 312, and this process is still in train in the 400s. It's really lengthy and gradual. Um, More lengthy, I believe, than, for example, Islam and the spread of Islam uh, in its day. So you have this period of decades in which paganism kind of slowly dies out and slowly dies down. Um, but by the time you have Julian coming along in the 360s, that decline is already um, in quite an advanced stage. So it's not so much a matter of one culture replacing another, people converting in a simple manner and disowning their former pagan friends and family. Um, it's I'm trying to think of a modern example of that. It's a bit like the way in which Christianity itself has been replaced by secularism and rationalism in the modern age. It's more a kind of decline in which people gradually fall away. Um, Even people within a single family may fall away over time rather than all converting or deconverting at once. Um,
Again, if I may add, we this justice forum is just as in our episode with Peter had a while ago, that it's just started with the elites, right, and then it changed slowly down so to the lower forms that were influenced by the nobles and those the elite families. So it began on the top and then gradually fell down, right?
Yeah, I mean, you get bottom up and top down dynamics. You get I mean, the fact that Constantine converts, so the emperor is now a Christian, that has a massive effect, and so there's that top down effect. You also have a bottom up effect because Constantine would not have been able to be a Christian if there hadn't already been a grassroots movement that had existed and was there for him to enter. So you get the top down effect, and you also get the bottom up effect.
It's like
Um,
let's say Kim Kardashian wears a new dress, and everyone gonna have that new dress, you know.
yeah, Constantine was the Kim Kardashian of his day.
But I want to talk a little bit. Now we going to talk more about the Renaissance as well, where it's really and I know that you want to talk about that too, but I want to talk about Paganism and Charlemagne and when he converted the Germanic world and how did paganism still persisted because it was quite a brutal conversion. But again, we see it trying to be me. I mean, this just again. I want to refer to my episode, the Holy Roman Empire, when with Peter Hedder, how mainly in his book he states that it was mainly the elites, right, that were converted, and again, like we said before, it's the top dog that gets converted at first, and then slowly go down. So let's talk about paganism. And I know we're jumping a little bit right now, but let's talk a little bit about the paganism in the world of the Carolingians and Christianity.
Now the Carolingians, that wouldn't be particularly one of my areas of focus, but I mean, if we were to look at the Renaissance,
Yeah,
there's a lot that can be
yeah, of
said
course,
there.
yeah. So, as you know, sorry for cutting off a bit. It's a little bit because I normally try to admit and do try to prepare more, but I didn't have much time this week. I've been quite busy, but let's jump a little bit further and, like you said, go to the Renaissance because that's really where you see art and Michelangelo's and the statues, and of course we have the Fourth Crusade accounts for the Renaissance. And long story short, but let's talk about how when all this artwork and that came from Constantinople and all how this would influence the Renaissance and how revival in and this is really where kind of atheism as well, right, begin to be a new thing. So let's talk a little bit about classical revival and paganism in the Renaissance.
Yeah, this is a really interesting story, and it starts in the East. It starts in the dying Byzantine Empire. And there have been pagan revivals in the medieval period in the Byzantine Empire. There have been various people who have persisted in trying to revive the old classical Greek traditions, particularly the philosophical tradition of Plato. And what happens in the mid 15th century, the Byzantine Empire collapses. It's finally overcome by the Muslim Ottomans. And what happens then is that you get people and ideas coming westwards to Italy, and influencing people there. And among those ideas is a strand of paganism, and you get this revived paganism being implanted in Italy, and people in Italian intellectual culture look back to the ancient world as being this glorious golden age, and they see themselves as being modern Romans, modern versions of the Romans, and try to recreate the culture of the ancient world. And for some of those people, recreating ancient religion is part of that. Also rediscovering the non-religious traditions of the ancient world. Lucretius, for example, who was not quite an atheist, but as close to that as existed in Roman high culture. You get his work being rediscovered, and you get rationalism springing up. Um, and classical pagan influence in the Renaissance is seen in various different ways, in literature, in art, in architecture. Um, You even get a guy called there was a guy called Sigismondo Malatesta who was one of the local lords in Italy who builds what's effectively a pagan temple known as the Tempio Malatestiano. It's technically a Catholic church, and you can still go to mass there even today. But the decor and the furnishings of it are pagan, and was seen as such at the time. You get other figures. You get a group of people called the Roman Academy springing up in Rome, who get in trouble with the Pope because they embrace classical paganism. And again, they're into the philosophy of Plato in particular. Yeah, you also get figures in Florence, Marsilio Ficino, well-known philosopher who sort of blends Christianity with paganism. Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, um, uh, another such figure who was influenced by Ficino, has this great project again of kind of blending Christian ideas with paganism, and it's really extraordinary. You get these people who are on some level sincere Christians, also invoking pagan spirits and powers, borrowing from the philosophy of Plato, and creating this kind of syncretic new form of belief and practice, which blends medieval Catholicism with these quite different strands of thought from ancient paganism.
Did the church ever try to stop this blasphemy, so to speak, or did they just kind of they just it's gonna be a short thing. It's just a phase kind of thing.
Sorry, I didn't quite catch
No,
that.
did the Catholic Church did they try to stop this pagan revival, or did they try to think that it's just a phase, it's gonna pass by?
Yeah, you certainly get some people who are totally opposed to this, and say this is heresy, this is blasphemy. You cannot do this. This is, you know, mingling Christianity with the works of the devil. But you also get others who don't think that way. You even get popes who are quite sympathetic to this sort of thing. Um, uh, as with every age of history, you have radicals and fundamentalists, and you also have moderates and compromisers. And this period of history was no different. And sometimes you get the same people who are both uh, hardline and moderate in different ways. Like, for example, St. Thomas More in Britain, who was plugged into these novel, radical currents of Renaissance thought, which were connected with paganism, but was also, in other respects, deeply religiously conservative, and was a strong Catholic involved in persecuting Protestants. So there's often blurred lines, there's often ambiguity, both with individuals and across society as a whole.
Something that happened in the Renaissance as well is, of course, that statues began to be sculptures, began to be a new thing as well with the revival of the classical world. And as you may know, the sculptures were kind of, as well in the Christian world, were frowned upon for the light, well, weren't they? For the lightness of, I don't remember exactly why, but they were frowned upon when new sculptures. So let's talk about the revival of sculptures as well. Was this a part of the pagan revival in a sense?
Yes, yes, and indeed the recovery of ancient sculptures would be part of this as well. I mean, for example, one of the popes, whose name I've actually forgotten. I think it was Paul II. Um, on the one hand, he was dead against revived paganism and persecuted people who tried to revive the old ways. But on the other hand, he saw no contradiction between that and going around Rome and gathering together classical sculptures and putting them in his own garden, so that they could be venerated as elements of this glorious Roman past that he was in love with, just like the pagans were in love with it.
Hmm. And So then I want to go next from the Renaissance, and I want to ask you, yeah, now you want to talk about the revived paganism in the 18th century as well, and eso, sorry if I say this wrong, esoteric movement that grew from there. So let's talk a little bit of the esoteric movement. I'm sorry for jumping a little bit this episode, but let's let's go and talk a little bit about the esoteric movement in the 18th century. That would that is we talked about would go into Freemasonry as well.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Uh, we usually think of the 18th century as being an era of rationalism, the age of reason. And that is true, of course. There's a lot of rationalist philosophy going on, and it spreads through society. You have ordinary people, likewise, falling away from traditional Christianity. You have a rise of skepticism, but you have something else going on as well. Um, you also have the rise of these sometimes slightly eccentric, um, occult, esoteric groups, which don't fit in either to traditional Christianity or to the rising rationalist movement. And one example would be Martinism. Uh, that was a movement that was particularly associated with France, um, and had magical, esoteric, mystical aspects to it. Swedenborg, um, the great Swedish scientist and mystic, there was his movement. And as you say, Freemasonry is part of this as well. And most Freemasons, of course, back then, just like today, would have been just bored middle class men, businessmen, and so on, who would have just been looking for a club to attend, once a month and get drunk with their friends. But there's also elements of mystical
I
religion
know
in
that
there.
this kind of off topic, but I keep thinking of the Simpsons episode when Homer joined the Freemasonry club.
Yeah, I mean that's yeah. I mean, if you can get something like that onto The Simpsons, then that shows that it's really a cultural stereotype. Um, But yeah, I mean, the Freemasons have always been largely like that, kind of social club for affluent men. But um, there were also these mystical, esoteric aspects to it, and not all Freemasons were into that, but some of them were. Some of them had strange, unorthodox religious ideas. And so even in this age of reason, even in the Enlightenment, um, you have these um, esoteric, colorful, exotic movements springing up, which don't fit into traditional Christianity, but don't conform to rationalism either. And that just goes further in the 19th century because you get the Romantic movement coming along, and the Enlightenment shades into the Romantic period. People stop thinking and start feeling. It becomes about emotion and sense. You have the cult of transgression and the rebel. Um, uh, you have this movement away from classical perfection and rationality into this more dangerous, less cerebral world, and paganism fits quite well with that. And you get figures from the Romantic movement, including big names. I mean, Keats and Shelley, for example, Goethe to some extent, they get on board with the revived pagan current, and start importing it into the cultural mainstream.
Where there's some, yeah, we spoke a little bit about Freemasonry, but where there's secret societies as well, kind of like form a cult kind of affection to this pagan religions. And when you talk about pagan religion, was it to worship the Roman gods like Mars, Jupiter, or those kind of gods, or were there different gods we're talking about here? How, what, let's talk a little bit about the religion they actually worship as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's for many revived pagans. I mentioned that the poets Shelley and Keats in this regard. It wasn't necessarily about worship. It was more to do with It was an artistic creed rather than a religious one. Um, it was looking at liberating ideas that would provide an alternative to Christianity and also rationalism. The point at which people start worship, well, actually, when Shelley dies, I think that the first, arguably the first revived pagan act of ritual, um, was when Shelley died, in it was the early 1820s. It could have been 1822, I believe. Um, yes, yeah, it was in 1822, and after after he died, he died at sea, and he and a couple of companions were killed in a storm at sea, and their bodies were washed up on the shore, and that this was in Italy. And their friends, who included Lord Byron, held a funeral ceremony for them, and that funeral ceremony was pagan. It was self-consciously pagan. They had a pouring of wine and oil. That they cremated the bodies, which was against Christian tradition, and they did this deliberately as a pagan act, and that was arguably the first act of pagan liturgy in Italy, certainly since the conversion to Christianity. Um, and in the late 19th century, you get more of that.
Mm.
For instance, you get an organization called the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn in Britain, which performs these ceremonies which blend Christian and pagan symbols. They worship Jesus, but they also worship Osiris, the Egyptian god, and they bring in other ancient deities as well. So it's the late 19th century you start getting acts of worship and liturgy and ritual really starting up in a serious way, and
Were
that
these
then
kind of
continues.
secret, like you said before, these were secret societies, or were they openly worshipping these gods?
Well, the Golden Dawn would have been a closed society on the model of Freemasonry. So you had to join it. You had to be initiated into it. You couldn't just turn up in the way that you can turn up at a church. Um, I suppose the first time that you start getting pagan type rituals outside the meetings of closed societies was in the early 20th century, when you get the woodcraft movement coming along,
Mm.
which is the movement that gave birth to the Scouts. And it was a movement for uh, young boys, essentially, trying to uh, teach them and build their character through woodcraft and the outdoor life. Um, and it included elements of what would have been regarded as paganism, particularly from the Native American peoples. And by modern standards, it was a bit cringe, and some people might even say it was racist, because it imported elements of Native American traditions, and taught them to these white kids. So, I mean, today we might find that a bit problematic. Um, but nevertheless, it was pioneering, because for the first time you had groups of people out in the open, not in meetings like in the Golden Dawn or Freemasonry, meetings of closed societies. You had people who were part of a mass movement, openly practicing rites and rituals that had their roots in these non-Christian traditions.
And again, I got asked the same question I asked before. Were the church aware of this and even tried to stop these hedonists in from practicing their rituals?
Yeah, and indeed, within the woodcraft movements, there were several branches. Within the woodcraft movements, you have a Christian faction which protests about these things. And there was one organisation called the Order of Woodcraft. Sorry, one organisation called the Order of Woodcraft Chivalry,
Try to say
and that
that
was
about many times.
Yeah, indeed, the Order of Woodcraft Chivalry, and that was nicknamed by its critics the Order of Witchcraft Devilry. Um, uh, and you always had this block of people for whom these experiments with non-Christian religion were a bit too much and went too far. And that was particularly the case in the Scouts, which was the most conservative and the closest of these movements to traditional Christianity.
So next, I want to talk about just the Third Reich, and because paganism in the Third Reich as well in Germany, they were kind of obsessed with the Norse gods, and Himmler as well had many castles where he tried to make kind of a pagan cult in a way. So let's talk a little bit about the Third Reich and their obsession with pagan gods and pagan rituals as well, because it's my understanding that the SS was very pagan inspired in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. There were leading Nazis who were into this sort of thing, um, and that wasn't a new development. Back in the 19th century, you had German nationalists who dabbled in pagan and esoteric ideas. Um, and there was a guy called Lance von Liebenfels, for example, a guy called Guido List, and they then fed into the same currents that fed into the Nazi Party. And that's no surprise really, because I mean Nazism was this kind of nationalist, extreme nationalist movement that came out of the Romantic movement, and modern paganism likewise has developed from the Romantic movement. So they went together. And yeah, Himmler was very interested in reviving Germanic paganism. Alfred Rosenberg was another Nazi who was seriously into that sort of thing. Hitler disliked this kind of uh, uh, activity because Hitler saw himself as being a rational man and a man of science, and someone who didn't have any truck with superstition and religious nonsense. But yeah, there were certainly people around him who were fascinated by the old traditions. And yeah, Himmler and the SS, there were rituals that were created. One example would be a wedding ritual, for example, that SS men sometimes went through, that drew on real or imagined ancient Germanic traditions. Um, and yeah, you also had an interesting attempt to kind of Nazify Christianity, and an attempt to marry up the Christian faith with the new faith of Adolf Hitler, and that was a kind of complementary way of trying to translate Nazism into
Didn't
religion.
the Catholic Church and the churches, Protestant churches in Germany, have to read from Mein Kampf and not the Bible as in the ceremonies?
I think there was one church where you had Mein Kampf placed on the altar. That there was I think Mein Kampf in the Bible and a sword. I think they had placed on the altar. Um, and I mean, to traditional conservative Christians, that would have been absolute blasphemy. And there were traditional conservative Christians who rebelled against that kind of thing. Um, but yeah, it's interesting that Nazism translated into religion, and it translated through pagan experiments like those of Himmler, and also through attempts to bastardize Christianity. Another thing that Himmler believed actually was that there was a theory um, that was strong in Britain as well, that witchcraft, the early modern witches, had in fact been the survivors of an ancient pagan cult, um, and that the people who were executed for witchcraft had been priestesses or priests of this surviving pagan religion. Um, and that was taken up in this country and eventually developed into Wicca, the modern witch religion. And in Germany, Himmler and some of the people who worked for him at the SS bought into the same idea, and thought that witches had been this kind of Aryan, pure pagan cult who had been repressed by the kind of Jewish Christians. It's historically nonsense, of course, but it was believed by a lot of people.
How did it spread in the right? Where was it just a Nazi elite, or were the common people to mind the Nazis, to call them that for lack of better words? Did the pagan religion kind of just keep contained within the Nazi elite, or yeah, did it spread to other
It would have
parts?
been, yeah, the biggest institution would have been the SS, and that would have been the primary organisation that would have spread these ideas and practices. And it would have been down to the level of individual SS men. You know, if you were an SS man and you had one of these pseudo-pagan weddings with a reading from the Eddas and music by Wagner, you know, it went down to the rank and file as well as the elite. But yeah, I think it would be primarily the SS, and other parts of the regime would have been less keen on this sort of thing. They would have been uh, yeah, they would have been focused either on reaching an accommodation with Christianity, or they would have been just basically secular.
Hmm. I want to end with modern paganism in 2024 and the 21st century because we discussed this briefly in our episode that I made a few years ago on on the ancient Greece religion and mythology. And there are people in Greece today, and in Scandinavia as well. There are people who worship the old Norse gods, and so, but I know you don't want to mainly talk about the Greek part. So let's talk a little bit about how the revival of the Greek gods and mythology has come back to Greece, and how this is mainly a minor cult, so to speak, right? It's not like is it, or is the main more mainstream these days? Is the ancient gods getting more popular and more attention in ancient Greece today?
Well, these groups tend to be small. In all countries, they tend to be small, um, and particularly in a country like Greece, which still has a fairly strong Orthodox Christian tradition, there is resistance to these ideas and practices. So these groups tend to be small in all countries, but they do exist and they're widespread. And yes, in Greece, you have modern pagans. In Scandinavian countries, you have them. In Britain, you certainly have them. In the United States, um, in Eastern Europe, in Russia, you have these groups. And they're very different in character. Often they're very radical and very progressive, environmentalist, politically on the left. In other cases, they might be nationalists, ultra conservatives, sometimes racists. Plus, no doubt, people, a lot of people who are in the spectrum between those two extremes. Um,
How does right wing people kind of how are they drawn into this pagan cult?
Well, it would be the idea of blood and soil, the cult of the ancestors, the idea that people today are members of this unbroken racial tradition, and that their ancestors practiced paganism thousands of years ago, and that makes it attractive to revive it today. There's some notion that Christianity is this illegitimate Jewish invention that interrupted the course of history. Um, and yeah, I mean, it's the ugly sides to the modern pagan movement. Most modern pagans don't fall into that category, but some do, and that has to be recognised.
I want to go way back again and discuss this about the Roman side, but when the Byzantine Empire came to power, were the Greeks who worshipped the ancient gods in the Byzantine world as well, or whether is that more of a new phenomena in Greece that paganism is revived?
Well, the Byzantine Empire was very Christian. It was very, very Christian. Um, you did sometimes get people with pagan sympathies, but they would uh, that sort of thing would be unwelcome. It wasn't encouraged, and could indeed be persecuted. You could end up dead for getting involved in that sort of thing. But there were always people. repeatedly in the Byzantine Empire, who were in love with these old pagan Greek ideas from the ancient world, particularly through the philosophy of Plato, and there was a consistent tradition of people reviving these ideas, sometimes secretly, not necessarily being open about it. But there was always that strand there, and then in the Renaissance it flowered, because that then went over to Italy, and there was a ripe audience for it over there. And that goes back to what we were saying earlier.
Mm. Well, I want to talk and one about as well a little bit because, as you know, the Greek Orthodox Church can be quite conservative. So, how do they view today modern pagans, and how are they kind of acceptance of how they let them just do the thing? And I generally keep repeating this question this episode, but yeah, it's I find it fascinating to know how, because they, like I said, they can be quite conservative in the Greek
Mm.
Orthodox world. So how are they viewing this pagan revival in Greece?
Well, I've seen some very critical views of this from Greek Orthodox Christians, and some insulting things have been said. The idea that modern pagans are these idiots, and these pathetic people who are reviving these long dead superstitions, and they should really be worshipping Christ, and embracing the light of the gospel. Um, I mean, that's basically one. It's like in the business world, and any business is going to be disparaging about one of its rivals. If you have a rival or a competitor, you're going to be talking its products down and criticizing it, and not wanting people to adhere to it. And it's really no different in the religious world.
I'm curious, have you met some of these pagans yourself, or and what if you have, what's your impression of them, and how yeah how what was your first impression of these people if you met some?
Yeah, I do. I do meet with modern pagans, and yeah, I know quite a few people in that culture. They're very diverse. They come in different shades of belief, different shapes and sizes, um, much in the same way as within Christianity, or within Islam or Judaism. You will find a real spectrum of people. You will find people from different backgrounds, men and women, young and old, from different social classes. Um, it's only a small movement, but it really is very diverse.
Are they easy to reach out to if you, let's say, you suddenly, oh, I want to try to worship pagan? Are they hard to find?
Well, unlike Christianity and Islam, modern pagans don't go looking for converts, so they won't come knocking on your door like Jehovah's Witnesses. Um, but I mean, you can meet people online. Uh, there's an awful lot of internet activity, and also, I mean, for example, where I live in London, there are certain groups that are established here. There are bookshops which act as hubs for the community. People also meet each other through word of mouth, and there are occasional festivals and conferences that get held, that interested observers can attend, as well as members of the community. So yeah, if any of your listeners are interested in this, then yeah, Google would be a good start, and yeah, online on Facebook, on Twitter, or X as it is now. There's a lot of people and a lot of groups out there that they can make contact with.
I think we're gonna round it up there. Thank you so much for joining the podcast. It's been a pleasure to talk about you about this fascinating topic. And I'm
Thank you.
sure we will talk more about this in the future. Before we go, do you have anything you want to promote, and where can people find your book, Paganism Persisting? When is it coming out? And it's in October, but do you have a date, or and where can people buy your book when it comes out?
Oh well, it's open for pre-orders at the moment on Amazon, fortunately. Um, and it's yes, it's coming out in October. There has been some adjustment to the specific date, and that might move again. But we're looking at October, which I'm sure will come around quickly. And yes, there will then be the usual process of waiting for the reviews to come out and seeing what people make of it. But yeah, we shall have to see.
I'm very much looking forward to reading it. Thank you again so much for coming on. This has been Without H12. Also, I do ask while I remember, do you have any social media where people can find you if they have further questions about paganism and Christianity and paganism persisting?
Sure, yes. I'm on Twitter, and my or X, and my handle is Robin_C_Douglas. Um, and you can always get hold of me there.
Thank you so much again for coming on. And this has been Without H12. We are available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, wherever you can find podcasts these days. If you're on Apple Podcasts, consider write a review, and I will try to find and read it on the podcast. If you are on Spotify, do us 5 stars if you like these episodes, or you can give us one if you like. It's a free country, at least in the West, in this part of the world. So you can give how many stars you like, though it would be nice with 5. So if you like this episode, check out some other episodes we have, and also stay tuned for May 21st when my new podcast to boldly talk where no man has talked before, and we will try to reach the final frontier with our new Star Trek podcast coming out very soon with my co-host Thomas Mackey, like I said in the start, who has been on this podcast 4 times. So make sure to check out some of those episodes to hype up for the new Pod Started podcast. I will be listening. I hope you will too. This has been Without H12. Like, share, and subscribe. And I'll see you next time.